Boa tarde a todos. Eu, eu sou Flávio Kosminski. Um momentinho, eu vou ajustar meu som aqui, desculpe. Meu nome é Flávio Kosminski e eu, em nome da ICF, desejo que todos sejam muito bem-vindos. Agradecemos aos nossos patrocinadores. Eu sou um voluntário da ICF e estou trabalhando hoje com a Ana Elisa como um apoio a esse evento. Muito obrigado, Ana, e obrigado a vocês por estarem aqui conosco. A International Coaching Federation é a maior associação global de coaching, presente em mais de 100 países e conta hoje com mais de 50 mil associados ao redor do mundo. E, neste momento, eu gostaria de agradecer aos nossos associados, aos líderes regionais, aos comitês e ao Conselho Deliberativo. Convidamos a todos para seguirem a ICF no LinkedIn e Instagram. Os links serão colocados no chat durante esse evento. E marcar o @ICF Brasil. A International Coaching Week é a maior celebração do coaching profissional do mundo e nessa semana acontecerão diversos eventos em mais de 20 idiomas e aqui no Brasil estamos com uma programação espetacular. Este evento está sendo gravado e vocês terão acesso a ele possivelmente amanhã ou logo após essa apresentação. Esse evento concede certificado de participação pela ICF Global e eu peço que vocês, por favor, preencham um formulário que será compartilhado ao final do evento, que serve também como uma avaliação desse evento. Você poderá gravar um vídeo sobre a sua experiência, então não se esqueça de acessar o link que estará ao final do evento no chat. Assim você recebe seu certificado e, por favor, se você se sentir confortável com isso, envie um vídeo com o seu depoimento. Gostaria de dar as boas-vindas aos nossos convidados do painel e registrar a alegria que temos deles estarem conosco nessa semana especial, quando eles vão compartilhar sua experiência e conhecimento. Eu vou apresentar o Dan e o Steve em inglês e, portanto, por favor, vocês têm acesso ao canal de tradução em português. E, por favor, façam isso agora, se ainda não fizeram. Este evento vai ser em inglês e, portanto, é importante, se você não é confortável ou não se sente confortável em acompanhar em inglês, por favor, vá ao canal de tradução. É um pequeno globo embaixo da sua tela do Zoom. Ok. Dan is a co-founder and a managing partner at Contemporary Leadership Advisors and a co-founder and board member of the Institute of Contemporary Leadership. He previously co-founded and co-managed the leadership and organizational effectiveness practice at AlixPartners. He works as a trusted leadership advisor to CEOs and their teams, helping them to ensure they have the right players with the right habits and alignment on the right priorities. Before working exclusively with senior corporate leaders and their teams, Dan was a clinically trained trauma and forensic psychologist. He gained invaluable wisdom from working as an attending psychologist in New York Hospital, world-renowned burn unit, and the New York City court system. He holds a PhD in clinical psychology from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and a Bachelor in Science in Psychology from the University of California at San Diego. He completed his postdoctoral studies at Cornell Medical College. He's a proud Bronx High School of Science graduate and a devoted board member of the amazing nonprofit Row New York. When he's not working, he spends time with his family in New Jersey, works on refining his composting skills, and enjoys acting out his wife's screenplays. Steve Garcia is also a co-founder and a managing partner at Contemporary Leadership Advisors, where he helps clients and lead faster, more adaptive organization and high-impact organization. He's also co-founder and board member of the Institute of Contemporary Leadership, which convenes executives to explore the future of leadership. Previously, Steve helped run AlixPartners leadership and organizational effective practice, developed SYNAPP, a people analytics platform acquired by Heidrick Struggles, led product marketing for Nortel Networks, digital switching, optical Ethernet, and voice over IP portfolios, and worked for the U.S. Congress Office of Technology Assessment. He holds an MBA from the University of Virginia and an education doctor in adult learning from North Carolina State University, where he studied how organizations' informal networks affect learning, change, and innovation. When he's not working, he spends time with his family in New Jersey, catching up on pop culture and falling down on mountains on his bike. Steve, I hope you don't get hurt when you fall down. So welcome, Dan and Steve. The floor is yours, or the screen is yours.
Great.
Thank you, Flavio.
Thanks, Flavio. And it's wonderful to see such a great crowd. And I think I speak for both Steve and I that our biggest regret right now is that we're not actually in Brazil with all of you. But I think I'm going to be lucky enough in a couple of months to actually be down in your beautiful country. So thanks in advance. We're very excited and very appreciative to Flavio, you and your team at ICF Brazil to invite Steve and I to talk to everybody. Steve and I had a book published last year called The End of Leadership as We Know It, What It Takes to Lead in Today's Volatile and Complex World. And our talk today is going to be on that topic. My assumption is that everybody on here is an executive coach working with senior employees, senior leaders, and teams who are operating in a lot of complexity and volatility. And it behooves us as coaches, which Steve and I are both like you coaches, to think about the current context and what it is that leaders need to do really well now, given the conditions that we are operating in. So Steve's going to go ahead and share a deck, which we will make sure everybody gets a copy of afterwards. So you needn't take any specific notes from any of the slides because you'll get them. And then just to go over a pretty simple agenda that we have. Steve, next slide. Great. So we're going to cover the situation that we find ourselves in terms of volatility and complexity in the organizations that we work in and in the world at large, and what it is we need to do in order to meet these challenges, both from an organizational perspective and a leadership perspective. And we're going to talk about the adaptive leadership fundamentals required to avoid the common traps that leaders fall into. And most importantly for everyone on this call, what as a coach you can do to be helping these leaders meet those challenges. And if Steve and I do our job right in terms of titrating how much we talk, we'll have time at the end for some questions and answers. But if people have questions that they'd like to share during the conversation, please go ahead and share those into the question app or into the chat. Our team here will help us see those. And if we're not going to get to it later on, we'll go ahead and address that at the time. All right. So we're off. Steve, I'm going to hand the mic over to you.
Thank you, Dan. And again, it's a pleasure to be here speaking with all of you. Thanks for the invitation. And if you've got questions along the way, please put those in the chat and we will endeavor to answer those, but we'll also try and save time at the end. So let's jump in. I think most everyone on this call, I know you all are executive coaches, you work with leaders, and I'm sure you're not at all surprised by the idea that the business environment has really changed in recent years. It has become far more interconnected than it once was. You can now move information, capital, even talent. I can go on Upworks and get someone to help me do a project, in 24 hours. And this interconnectivity, this increased connectivity, has really turned the business environment into a far more complex system, which makes it a lot harder to understand cause and effect, or to predict what's going to happen down the road. And just one example of that I am really keen on is in 1932, the half-life, so the time it took for the knowledge that you would learn as an engineer to be usurped was 35 years. And today, the half-life for the knowledge you gain as an engineer, as an undergraduate, is 2.5 years. So, in less time than it takes to earn the degree, what you've learned has become far less relevant, which just goes to show that the pace of change has really, really accelerated. And it's a very different world than it was certainly when I was growing up. So one analogy that Dan and I like to use is this idea of a puzzle and a Rubik's Cube. So the puzzle on the left, a puzzle can be really complicated. My daughter and I put together puzzles with like 2,000 different pieces, and it takes a while. And it's certainly a complicated task, right? It's really hard to finish it at first, but there are some rules that you can apply, right? You can look for the corner pieces. You can look for all the pieces that have an edge. You can group the different pieces by color, and if you apply that algorithm, right, you can sort of work that algorithm, and over time, you're going to solve the puzzle. And I think that's the way the world used to be. You could, apply yourself, you could hire experts, you could figure things out, right? The way that you would solve a problem on Tuesday was pretty similar to the way that you might solve it on a Saturday, right? Things were sort of consistent. I think the world has become much more like a Rubik's Cube, where when you change one side, everything else around it changes. So one thing that's in the puzzle, right, the pieces always connect the same way. Again, it doesn't matter when you work on it, they're always going to fit together the same way. In the Rubik's Cube, right, there's a much more dynamic element to it, where you change one side and all the other sides change as well. And I think that's the way that leaders feel today, right? Despite their best efforts, they're really struggling because things have gotten much more complicated, and what worked in the past no longer works in our current business environment. And there's really, we see that in many different ways, right? But some of the key problems that we hear about in our coaching practice is that it used to be leaders could plan up front. They could, sort of come up with a strategic plan at the start of the year, and they could sort of cascade that down. They could communicate that to the different functions. And then at the end of the year, you could reward everyone based on, how well they achieved what it was they were tasked with doing. And again, in the old world, that worked pretty well. But today, upfront planning is much less effective because the world is changing so fast that, before you finish the plan, the circumstances, the situation has changed, and the plan is no longer relevant, right? Also, the time it takes to communicate the strategy really creates delay, slows things down. And in fact, we've done research that shows that for every level in the hierarchy at which the strategy is shared, people understand it 25% less well. So by the time you get a few levels down in the organization, people really struggle to understand the big picture or what the organization is trying to accomplish. Also, and I think we're all familiar with this, organizational silos really get in the way of trying to get things done. We create value in an organization horizontally, right? R&D, manufacturing, supply chain, marketing, sales, right there. They're creating value horizontally across functions in the organization, but we manage vertically. And that mismatch between how we create value and how we manage creates a lot of friction that creates problems. And you see a lot of, lack of collaboration across the different functions or regions. Top-down communication also inhibits feedback. Organizations have great tactics and mechanisms, approaches in place to communicate down the hierarchy, but we really don't have much to communicate back up. When we do employee engagement surveys, more often than not, that's because we want to understand how people are how they're, whether they're engaged or not, whether they plan on quitting. It's really not to get feedback on the strategy itself. So there's really not a good way to understand what the people on the front lines who are doing the work, what they're seeing, and how we might have to adapt. And then the command and control approach, which again works really well when the environment is stable, but in an environment where it's unstable, where we really need everyone to be able to sort of figure out on their own what the right thing to do is, and really put forth greater discretionary effort, command and control really undermines that. So I think these are some of the reasons why the traditional operating model has not kept up with the business environment and what's required for success in today's world. And that has pretty dramatic consequences. And again, I think we all see this in the conversations we're having with leaders, people we're coaching, right? They're having a tough time, and that's evidenced in some of these statistics. 3/4 of all organizations say that they struggle to execute strategy. 77%, more than 3/4, say that they're not prepared to deal with disruption that they know is coming. 1/3 of all senior leaders report feeling extremely burnt out. And one comment we heard the other day was that the other 2/3 just are not being honest about how they feel. So I think leaders are really having a difficult time and are looking to alleviate the anxiety and stress that they're under. And $900 billion in wasted transformation efforts each year, and that's just from digital transformation efforts. So the figure is much greater when you consider all organizational transformation efforts. So I think we're seeing the consequences, the impact of this mismatch between how we run our companies and the business environment is really significant and problematic. The good news is that there are other ways to organize, other ways to lead that can be much more productive in a really complex, disruptive, VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous environment that we find ourselves in. And actually, these systems are all over the place. We see them. Complex adaptive systems are systems that are made up of many different parts, and each of those parts sort of follows simple rules and operates on its own, and sort of reconfigures itself in response to the changing world. And complex adaptive systems are not as efficient as sort of more rigid hierarchical systems, but they're far more resilient and thrive in complexity and disruption. And so one of the things that Dan and I would argue leaders can do is to really try and think about how they can adopt the practices of a complex adaptive system and model those within their organization. So on the left-hand side here, we show one of the way that we sort of think about the adaptive operating model, and on the right-hand side, we sort of contrast that with the traditional hierarchical model. And the adaptive model, again, it's resilient in unstable environments, and the traditional operating model, it's a very efficient, but only in stable circumstances. And we're now in a place where we can't count on stability the way that we once could. So some of the key differences, the adaptive operating model, it's really uses rapid test and learn cycles. So as opposed to sort of creating a strategic plan and then working on that strategic plan for 12 months and then creating a new strategic plan, adaptive operating models use rapid test and learn cycles, sort of like an agile methodology, where they're constantly thinking about, like, whether it's weekly sprints or monthly or quarterly, they're looking to see, are they having the impact that they want to have on a more frequent basis, and then changing course if they're not. So adapting as they go. Adaptive operating models are sort of use horizontal networks. We'll talk more about that today as a way of organizing versus top-down hierarchy. They're aligned around simple rules, things like purpose, heuristics, to sort of govern behavior versus aligning around specific tasks. And they decentralize decision-making amongst the parts versus having a centralized decision-making, a small number of folks at the top of the organization making the decision. So just sort of some of the differences between the adaptive model and the more traditional command and control model. But this requires, so this adaptive model, which again is informed by complex adaptive systems, requires that leaders show up and behave in really new and different ways, right? So you've got this faster, more complex business environment that requires a more adaptive way of working. That means leaders need to do things differently than they have in the past. And that, as we all know, as coaches, that's really tough. It is tough to change how we work, how we behave, how we show up. Even in the best of circumstances, that can be challenging. That's one of the reasons that coaches are in demand, is because we can help to facilitate that shift among our clients. And so that's really the reason that Dan and I wrote this book, was because we wanted to sort of share what we've seen, what we've experienced around how the world is changing, how organizations need to operate differently, and most importantly, what that means for leaders. So I'm going to hand it off to Dan, who's going to sort of share, give a quick overview of the 10 leadership traps. So the way we framed the book was in terms of traps. Again, as coaches, you will all be familiar with when you do like a 360 feedback assessment. Leaders always want to go to, they ignore what they're doing well, and they go to what it is that they need to do differently. And so we sort of frame the book that way by talking about what are the traps that leaders fall into, because we find that really gets people energized around change. So Dan's going to give you a quick overview on the traps that we talk about and how to avoid them, and then we're going to talk about two of them specifically in this conversation.
Great. Thanks, Steve. And I just want to note that someone dropped a really good question in the chat that I just want to address quickly before we go over the leadership traps, because they're all very relevant to the question, which is, in the context of coaching leaders in today's volatile and complex world, what is our opinion on the impacts of AI on the work environment, and how can leaders best navigate these changes to foster resilience and innovation in their teams? Great question. I was just in, sorry, I'm getting a thing about my speaking language. I was just in Chicago at the Society for Industrial Organizational Psychology's annual conference, which is 5,500 psychologists meeting to talk about all of these really riveting issues. And I can tell you that in almost every conversation, AI came up, and its relevance in every aspect of working. How is this disruption going to play out? What are the impacts going to be on employees, on organization, on leaders? I was on a panel with the chief talent officer for Johnson & Johnson, where they have 135,000 employees, and they are employing AI in various aspects of their talent management because the scale that they operate on is so vast that they will greatly benefit from having this additional technology. And it is making major disruptions. We sort of subscribe to the idea that everyone's anxiety about being replaced by AI is really AI will not replace humans, but humans with AI will replace humans without AI. And so it's really imperative on leaders in organizations to be early adapters and adopters to the artificial intelligence and how to be able to use it effectively as co-pilots in the work that they're doing, and with their employees, and enabling them to create incredible efficiencies, and even quality of work that can come if used appropriately. And while there are all sorts of limitations and problems with the current AI that we're all playing with, in 3 to 5 years, it'll be at a completely different level. And so it's really critical that we do adopt these things, and stay, if not ahead of the curve, at least on the curve. And I think our leaders are going to be experiencing a lot of resistance, which we'll talk about as one of the key traps that folks fall into. And as coaches, I'll be attending a conference on technology and coaching that's sponsored by New York University's master's program in coaching and consulting in a couple of weeks, where they go very deep into the use of various different technologies, including AI, that coaches can use with their coachees. And us as coaches being good co-pilots with AI will make a huge difference with the coachees that we're working with. And again, those coaches that are not adopting that technology, I think, are going to find themselves less impactful than those that are. So super long-winded response to a great question, and please bring up similar things in the chat as we go along. So given that we've got all this disruption going on, leading is even more challenging, as Steve pointed out, and our leaders today fall into these traps. And as coaches, part of our job is going to be to help them avoid those traps. So I'm just going to very briefly touch on each of these now so that you have an idea. I'm going to drop in this slide into the chat in just a little bit so you have a copy of it, as well as you'll get a copy of the deck later. These are all of the chapters in our book. In each one, we talk about the trap, and we interview different leaders to talk about how they've either struggled with them or overcome them. And it in and of itself is a good guide for leaders to be able to read. So I have all my coachees read the book. One, it helps getting to sleep at night, but it also gives them a few, some wisdom on what to be able to do. So the first trap that leaders oftentimes fall into is overemphasizing and valuing their expertise over their relationships. So one of the ways that we think about leadership within a complex adaptive system is that you are as powerful as the relationships that you have within the network that exists within your organization. And I remember one of my early advisors telling me that real power is being one phone call away from the answer. not necessarily having the answer. And one of Steve's coachees that he worked with, we have a great story in the chapter about how he was able to make a huge difference because of that ability to be one phone call away. So it's not just about you, it's about your relationships. The vulnerability paradox is all about how our leaders need to be able to be vulnerable. And historically, we've tried to get our leaders to always project confidence without humility. And nowadays, in order to get people to follow you, you need to be able to make yourself vulnerable, show the right level of humility, and not come over as overconfident, because that's going to be a red flag for folks. Stop strategizing and start doing. Strategic plans are absolutely critical. Without one, you're not going to go anywhere. But if you are beholden to that and not constantly what we call strategically doing, you're going to find yourself far afield from what you need to be doing as the conditions change. That's the nature of volatility, is things change. And if you are not adjusting your plan according to that change, you're going to find yourself not succeeding. Freeing your people with purpose-driven rules. So it's absolutely critical that leaders who are talking about purpose and the purpose of their organizations operationalize it and live it. And without that, not only do you create a lot of skepticism within the organization, but you limit your people to being able to operate more independently because they fully understand and have integrated in the purpose of the organization and can use that as a North Star and guiding light. Why community organizers beat superheroes. So our leaders, like all of us, oftentimes grow up wanting to be the hero, wanting to be the superhero, the sheriff that captures the villain, and saving the day and being the most important person. And many of our executives are paid lots of money with the expectation that they are going to add that level of value. But it's actually what we call here in the US community organizers, like our former President Barack Obama was early in his life, who tend to be the types of leaders within complex adaptive systems that are able to activate all of the different players in the system in order to be optimized and help get the objectives met. So it's not really about you being the superhero, it's about you activating and making others heroes. Viva la resistance, which is one of the things we're going to talk more in detail about, is all about overcoming resistance to change through working with it and honoring it and leaning into it and being curious about it, as opposed to just thinking you need to steamroll it. And we'll go into a lot more detail on that in a little bit and how you as coaches can help your leaders that you're working with accomplish that. Resilience beats efficiency is all about how in today's corporate environments, we've become so good at being lean and squeezing out profit through as much efficiency as possible that at times it makes us brittle. And Steve talked earlier about the transition from jigsaw puzzles to the Rubik's Cube. One of the other game analogies we use now is Jenga. So the pandemic showed that all you need to do is pull out a couple of the logs in that Jenga tower regarding your supply chain, regarding your ability for your people to get the office, and the whole thing can come tumbling down because we don't have enough fat on the bone to survive those things. The siren song of certainty is all about the trap of wanting to be certain before you make decisions, when the reality is today, certainty is really hard to come by. We are swimming in ambiguity. Things change so quickly. They're so interconnected that it's very difficult to predict cause and effect the same way that we have traditionally. And you have to be able to operate in that environment. Data-driven decisions still need a driver. is all about making sure that our leaders are not over relying on data and underemphasizing their judgment of that. It's very easy to be led astray by data. We want people making data-driven decisions, but we want to make sure that they're using their judgment in there. And there's a reality that today we have so much information, so much data that at times becomes incomprehensible to us. And so it's really critical that leaders be able to effectively manage that, not only for themselves, but for their organizations. And finally, when best isn't best, that trap is all about how we want to rely on best practices. What has historically been the right thing to do here? I feel confident doing it because, hey, it's a best practice. But in reality, things change so quickly that what was a best practice may not be the right practice now. And actually, there are times when people who are highly experienced are at a disadvantage because if they're not thinking in this much more adaptive fashion and questioning whether best practices are still the appropriate thing and they over rely on those, they may find that they're led astray as a result of really using old practices. All right, Steve, I need to catch a breath. I'm handing it back over to you, buddy.
Terrific. Okay, so maybe quickly in the chat, we'd love to hear, just you can put the number 1 through 10. Which of these traps do you find that the leaders you work with fall into most frequently? And Dan, I can't see the chat, so I'm going to have to rely on you to.
Yeah, if people write them, okay, yeah. So let's see. We've got a pretty good diversity of scores so far. I'd say right now it's about equal in terms of what people are
across all.
There's a lot actually about leaders overemphasizing their expertise rather than relationships.
Well, good, because we're going to go into that. So that's a nice segue.
Yeah, and there's also, I think I've seen quite a few around people over relying on best practices.
Yes, as consultants, we are often asked to share best practices, and we like to reframe that as practices to consider versus best practices, because our argument would be, again, as Dan pointed out, what works well in one organization may not work well in another. Okay, so well, it's good if there's a nice distribution, because that means that we picked the right chapters to write about in the book, Dan.
Yeah, yeah.
And so what we're going to do, so and then maybe in the chat as well, type in the name of some companies that you have seen effectively. So this is on the other side. Where have companies successfully navigated these traps? And what strategies what approaches have they used? Where have you seen leaders actually manage these traps really well? And again, Dan, I'm going to hand it over to you to
absolutely
results. So much for you resting your voice.
Yeah, no rest for the weary. Okay. Oh, AstraZeneca is identified. Bayer. Very good. Both great companies. And obviously in every company, it's going to be inconsistent throughout the company, but in your travels, where have you seen companies doing this, navigating these traps pretty well? All right, J&J. Yeah, we love J&J. They're an important and loved client of ours.
A lot of life sciences, I'm hearing.
We're going to have to let Michael Ehret, the Chief Talent Officer at J&J, know how often this is coming up. He'll be very happy. And Flavio Toyota is always, has such a great history around management. Novartis, Eli Lilly. Everybody here in the US is hoping Eli Lilly produces more of their weight loss drugs. There's a national storage up here. Mondelez, BNP Paribas, Novo Nordisk. Yeah, Marcia, same thing for them. Great. And someone was just calling out that it's not necessarily the entire company, but certain teams in there. And that's absolutely true. We've never met a company where it's consistently just great along the, across the board. It's usually pockets of where you'll see folks doing a great job on this and folks who are struggling. All right. Nice. It's great to see so many different so many different companies noted here as doing a good job on it.
Okay, so one of the areas Dan and I wanted to dig a little deeper on in this discussion was around the first trap. It's not about you, right? So this is about when leaders make the mistake of leading through expertise rather than through relationships, which we've seen as fairly, pretty frequently leaders fall into that trap. So I want to start with a really quick analogy. We're all familiar with graphite and diamond, two minerals that in many ways could not be more different from one another. Very different properties. Graphite is dull, it's soft, it's opaque. It's used as a lubricant in industrial applications, right? And diamond, on the other hand, brilliant, hard, and transparent. It is used as a cutting tool, right? In industrial applications. So really dramatically different substances, could not be in many ways more different. What's fascinating to Dan and I is that both are made entirely of carbon, right? So how is it possible? How can you have two materials that are so different in terms of their properties, but they're both made entirely of carbon? And of course, the answer is that it's because how the carbon molecules are structured, right? How they connect to one another. In graphite, they're connected in sheets that slough off. In fact, I have a big hunk of carbon or a big hunk of graphite, and when I carry it around, like you get graphite all over yourself. And in diamond, the molecules are connected in this tetrahedral pattern that creates some of the strongest bonds in the universe. So the point that we want to make with this example is that it's not just what something is made out of, it's how those parts are connected that has a really big impact on the way that thing performs, right? So it's not just the properties, it's the connection between the parts that has a really big impact. And organizations are comprised of connections as well. So we do lots of organizational network analysis where we look to understand how different people interact with one another. And so this is an example. I believe this is a medical device company, if I remember correctly. And the dots, the nodes, if you will, represent individuals, and the lines between them represent the presence of relationships. And the thicker the line, the stronger the relationship, and where there's no line connecting the dots, there's no relationship. And the size of the dot indicates how many people go to that person for help, getting their work done, et cetera. So organizations are made of connections too. And just to build on the question earlier about AI, what we're seeing now, some of the things we're doing now is using AI, like with an understanding of who's connected to who in the organization, we can use AI to predict how change will unfold across the organization, like an epidemiology model, like how a virus spreads. We can understand how ideas are going to spread across the organization as well. So one of the ways that we're using AI today and going forward. Okay, so organizations are made of connections too. And just like with the diamond and the graphite, this has a really big impact on performance. So here we're going to use a really simple example. We've got a group made up of R&D, marketing, and sales. Okay, so I'm going to ask you a question. Based on this network diagram, right, who is most likely to leave the organization? Put that in the chat, please. And Dan, you're going to have to read. You got to tell me what folks are saying. You're my interpreter here. So who is most likely to leave?
Let's see. We've got Peter, Peter.
Yes, exactly, right? So Peter appears to be on the outskirts, right? He's not connected to anyone, right? Based on that, we might infer that he's less engaged and perhaps on his way out. Okay, a little tougher. Who is best positioned to get things done within their department?
All right, we've got some Alex's.
Alex, yes. Alex, in this case, strong relationships between Alex and the rest of his team members, very reciprocal. Things aren't going to fall through the cracks. Everyone knows what their respective role is. They're not going to step on each other's toes. Exactly, right? Okay. Last one, and this one's the toughest. Who has the best chance of coming up with creative new ideas? Dan?
Let's see, we've got Sue, Peter, Peter.
Yes, Sue. Peter's an interesting choice because presumably Peter's connected to some other folks if he's not connected to these. But in this case, Sue, because she's connected to marketing, sales, and R&D, she's able to combine different perspectives and to come up with new, novel ways of thinking about things, right? So she's got a diversity of perspective, a diversity of insight that she can draw on to come up with new ideas. And the research really bears this out. The research shows that people who are in Sue's position are actually generate more and better ideas than anyone else in this example. So what this just goes to show us is that connection in a really simple example does really matter, right? And we can draw insights and conclusions based on how people are connected within the organization. And research that Dan and I have done actually shows that your position in the network is hugely predictive of your performance. This is both good and bad, right? It's good from the standpoint of if a leader understands the importance of their connections and their position in the network, then they can actually try and modify their network to achieve their objectives and their career goals, right? So the opportunity so understanding this gives you the opportunity to change it, which is empowering. At the same time, I want to acknowledge that there are folks who, based on demographics, race, gender, age, et cetera, can have an easier time connecting with others because we tend to connect people like ourselves. So if everyone at the top of the organization is, older white male, then that becomes easier for other older white men to connect with them. So there's a tension there that we have to manage. But network position is really important in terms of your ability to perform, get things done in your organization. And so we think it's really critical that folks understand that so that they can modify their network accordingly. So here's a really simple example. We've got an organizational chart on the left, which is how we tend to think about organizations. Maybe the organizational chart on the left, or maybe a business process, right? And we would say that's really the theory around how work gets done, but it's the informal network on the right, which is the real world practice of how work gets done, right? That's really the way that people are interacting to make things happen. And like, if we look at this example, we can see that Stern on the left-hand side looks like he's pretty low in the organization. And so we might make some assumptions about that. But when we look at the actual network, we see that he is very critical to how information flows and how work gets done across this organization. And if something were to happen to him, if he wins the lottery or gets hit by a bus or whatever, it's going to really dramatically change how this organization operates. In fact, if you do the math behind the diagram, it's Stern who's the one who's really doing the best job of connecting all three of these groups. So it's going to have a big impact. The problem as leaders is that we tend to make decisions based on the left, on the org chart, and less often are we using the information on the right, the informal network. And so the danger is we're making decisions with blinders on, so we can't see what's really happening. When we take the network perspective, not only can it help us to be more successful in our own careers, but it can help us to really understand how work gets done and really, benefit the organization as well. Okay, so another quick quiz. How many strong reciprocal relationships, so mutual relationships, do high-performing leaders maintain? How many strong reciprocal relationships do high-performing leaders maintain? And so these are relationships where if someone called and asked for your help, you would stop what you're doing and help them. Or if you were really in trouble and you needed help, you would turn to them and ask them to help out. So how many do you think high performing leaders have? Is it less than 10? Is it 10 to 19? Is it 20 to 29, 30 to 39, 40 to 49, or more than 50? Go ahead and put that in the chat. We're going to make Dan do some more work here.
Yeah, there's a lot of less than 10s, and the second place is 20 to 29. But
29. Okay, so the answer is right. High performing leaders maintain strong on average, maintain strong relationships with 12 to 18 people. And what this means is that you really need to think about where do you want to place your bets? Who do you want to have those relationships with, right? Because it takes energy to maintain every one of these relationships. So if all your relationships are to people who can help you do one thing, maybe you're not getting what you need to really achieve your broader goals, right? So we like to say that leaders, and when we're coaching leaders, help them think through what's the portfolio of relationships that's really going to benefit them and what they're trying to achieve. And we've got a worksheet that we use. Dan, can you? I think you got that. I emailed that to you.
yeah, exactly. I'm going to drop that into the chat.
Drop that in the chat. So this is a tool that you can use with your clients, or even, for yourself, to really help think about how do you want to. It's a way of thinking about your own network, and is it really structured the way that you need it to be for you to get done what it is you want to get done. Okay, so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dan, who's going to talk about one of the other traps, Viva la Resistance.
Excellent. So no one likes resistance to their ideas and what they want people to do. But alas, it is actually something that is not only natural, it's actually adaptive. Steve, can you shift to our next slide? So the trap that we encourage leaders to avoid, and whom you as the coaches can help them, is to pull back a little bit on how much they have to overcome resistance to change, and instead think about how they can work with it. So next slide. Great. So when we think about organizational resistance to change, we think about it as the natural inclination or opposition that will emerge within a system, complex adaptive system, when it's confronted with the need to really change its structure, its processes, its cultures, and its strategies. And this resistance can manifest itself at various levels within the organization, from your employees to your middle managers to your executives, as well as happening within teams, group functions, and external stakeholders. So this is something that is a natural part of the process whenever you're engaging in significant change. Next slide. Okay, so in the chat, and Steve, you might be able, oh, you still can't see it, I can. Go ahead and tell us, how often do your coachees report that one of their biggest headaches is others' resistance to change that is doing what you want them to do, or not doing, resistance to doing what you want them to do. So go ahead and just note whether this is something you see very often, sometimes. Someone said very often. Yeah. Got it. Okay, so we're getting a lot of oftens, very oftens, no rarelys or never. So those realities are just like mine. My coachees almost at some point always complain that if people would just do what I tell them to do, we would be doing a lot better. But they resist. They have ideas of their own. They think my ideas are not the right ones. And boy, that's really slowing us down, and it's really frustrating. And for Flavio, if they didn't, they wouldn't look for coaching. Exactly. So, when people complain to Steve and I about how dysfunctional their organizations and teams are, they think that we think that's a bad idea. We love that. That's our business model. So thank God. Okay, great. Thanks everyone for weighing in on that. Steve, next slide. What are some of the causes of people's resistance to change in organizations? We're going to talk about our top 10, but from what you've seen, what are some of those primary causes? Fear of failure. Yeah, fear. That keeps coming up. A lack of clarity. Fear of losing their position relevance. Shame. Yeah. Lack of clear ROI. Insecurity. Yeah, you're anticipating a lot of the ones we're going to talk about. Anxiety, fear, change being imposed on them, future uncertainty, feeling they've made it always the same way and it should still work today. Yeah, gee, if it ain't broken, why fix it? All right, terrific. So, Steve, let's go ahead and just share a little bit about how we think about this. And I think we're really going to repeat a little bit of what people have already shared. Fear of the unknown came up. This is when employees fear the uncertainties associated with the change, such as potential job loss, their roles changing, having to use new unfamiliar processes. Oh my God, how do we use this AI? Is the AI going to replace me? That also bumps up against their comfort with how things are done, the comfort with the status quo. They've become accustomed to their routines and their practices. They don't want to change them. We do group coaching around habit stacking and changing habits, because so much of what we do is really just a matter of the habits that we've developed, and it's hard to change them. So that creates resistance. Someone also pointed out earlier that there's a loss of control. People can feel like they're losing control over their work environment, and they're going to resist that. Almost everyone likes to have a certain amount of control, and when they feel like it's taken away, you're going to increase that resistance. Someone also pointed out lack of clarity. Sarah pointed that out, and quite a number of other folks did, in terms of lack of understanding or communication. So if the organization is not effectively communicating why we're doing it and the reasons for the change and the expected benefits, it's going to breed resistance. Negative past experience with change efforts. So many of our coachees have been through painful and unsuccessful change management initiatives. And oftentimes they have a certain level of skepticism. Oh yeah, this isn't going to work. And that creates resistance to them actually doing the things necessary to make it work. Cultural factors within the organization can impact resistance. So if you have a culture that values stability and tradition, that's going to drive a resistance to change more than one that is really valuing innovation and adaptation. So you'll want to make sure that you are understanding what the cultural waters that your coachee is swimming in and how that may be impacting the resistance that they're facing. Resource constraints. So many of our clients have limited resources, including their time, money, manpower, and that can oftentimes hinder efforts to change and increase resistance on here. Gee, how is this going to impact my ability to hire or hire the right people? Inadequate leadership support. So if the leaders are not fully committed to or engaged in the change process, it can undermine efforts and foster resistance. So you'll want to make sure that your coachees leaders are really behind it, or help, and if not so, help your coachees navigate that reality. So sometimes there's a lack of employee involvement. If people own what they co-create, and if you don't involve employees in the change process, they're not going to feel ownership over it and not going to feel like they have any agency or control. And that's going to go ahead and also ramp up the resistance. And finally, as someone pointed out in their comments, misalignment with individual goals. When employees perceive that the change is incongruent with their personal or career goals, they're going to resist it. So those are some of the key causes which align very nicely to the ones that folks called out themselves. Steve, let's look at some of the old school reaction to this resistance was, we're just going to steamroll over these folks. We're just going to go ahead and you're going to do it because I told you to do it. That's been a typical old school reaction, but the more contemporary adaptive reaction is to really think about where this resistance is coming from, approach this with a spirit of generosity and curiosity, the generosity being that the employees want to change for the better. But if there's resistance, there might be good reason for it. So you should be curious about that. And also just curious about what is driving that for them that may be not particularly adaptive, and how can you help them overcome that. But it's all about listening, and it's about listening to learn versus just listening to win or listening to fix. As Jennifer Garvey, one of the experts on complexity, talks about, in the world where things are so complex, we can't afford to just try to listen enough so we can win the argument, and we can't too quickly just try to fix the problem. We have to really listen to learn, to truly understand it. That's the more adaptive reaction. Next slide, Steve. Right. Okay, so Steve talked in detail about complex adaptive systems. These are organizations where we have lots of different agents in a dynamic relationship to one another, constantly adapting. And to the degree that they're effective at adapting to one another, the system is going to be effective and it will successfully achieve its objectives. And to the degree that it is not effectively adapting to one another, it's going to struggle. So, just to review what Steve shared earlier, these systems are interconnected and interdependent. And there's a lot of emergent patterns and outcomes that are often unpredictable. And that leads to unintended consequences or new patterns of behavior within the organization. And when leaders think that they must overcome the resistance to change, they risk creating the very resistance they seek to surmount, right? So some of our leaders are creating the resistance to change because of their reaction to trying to get through it. And as coaches, we want to be looking for this so that we can call it out with our coachees and help them change course, shift how they're approaching it, and actually deal with it, leverage it effectively, and ultimately overcome it. So remember, these complex adaptive systems are highly adaptive. The resistance can be a form of adaptation. They're nonlinear, meaning that small changes can lead to disproportionate and nonlinear effects. And due to the high degree of interconnectedness, one employee's resistance can oftentimes have ripple effects throughout the CAS. So when you're doing your stakeholder analysis, you want to really leverage the champions for the change. You want to be also really careful to understand who the resistors are and appreciate that in a system that's so interconnected, where everybody's either on Teams or Slack or Reddit, whatever it is that people are communicating, there are opportunities for the resistors to spread that resistance amongst other people much differently than it had prior to this kind of social media. Their resistance can oftentimes be a signal about the organization's adaptive capacity, and that the organization as a whole may need to change its strategy, communicate more effectively, or address some underlying issues that are limiting it from effectively adapting. And finally, perhaps the most important thing for you to take away and for you to be able to convey and communicate to your leaders that you're coaching is that resistance is one of the necessary components in any change process. And it allows us to balance the tension between order and disorder. So we talk about the job of the leader when it comes to change is to bring the team, the organization, the people to the edge of chaos, where they are going to feel compelled to change, but not drive it over the cliff. So there's a great article that McKinsey wrote years ago called Agility Rhymes with Stability, that has to do with the job of the leader to help balance those two different aspects of operations, having enough stability so that the team, the employees, are able to actually be agile. All right. So what should you be coaching the leader on in order to successfully leverage resistance in a complex adaptive system? Go ahead and put in a couple of your thoughts around what do you feel like you should be coaching your clients with in order to leverage resistance. Assume, every organization is a complex adaptive system. To the degree that it's effectively adapting, you'll see a real continuum. But for the folks that are in these systems and they're facing some resistance, how should you be coaching them? Go ahead and put your thoughts in the chat. I'll give you a couple of minutes to think about that. Got it. So Flavio is asking them, why the resistance to the resistance? Exactly. It's a great question. Fermina is calling out that you need to have both clear communication and active listening. Jose, asking questions, understanding. Leona, creating a safe environment. Yeah, we know that psychological safety and accountability are two keys to being able to effectively just operate and manage change. Roberto, increasing, enlarging, and deepening their connections, prioritizing that those he, she knows are not restraints. Okay. Zhao, visioning. Oksana, curiosity. Okay, great. So these are all exactly the sorts of things that we encourage you to be working with your leaders on. And Steve, let's go to the next slide. So in terms of coaching strategies to support leaders in this, we want to make sure that they understand the complex adaptive systems concepts. That's, really critical. That enables them to understand emergent behavior, the interconnectedness, feedback loops, nonlinearity. You're giving them language for how to make sense of what's going on within their systems. Towards that end, you want to also help them to foster a systems thinking mindset. Emphasize the importance of seeing the organization as a dynamic, interconnected system where employee resistance is an outcome of complex interactions. Help them recognize that addressing resistance requires understanding the broader context and dynamics. I find when I'm working with the senior executive leaders who are highly accomplished, they're sort of questioning how much value I'm going to really be able to add to them as a coach or as an advisor. And I'll often frame it for them that if they want to get to that next level of leadership and managing organizations, they have to start thinking from a systems perspective. And even these C-suite executives at Fortune 500 companies are really intrigued by the idea of being able to develop their mindset a bit differently, to see things as not just individual agents, one-offs, but thinking about how they interact with each other within a complex adaptive system. So we want to help them, the leader, diagnose the resistance. You want to work with them in order to understand that. You might want to do some interviews with some other folks, do some focus groups, and you want to come back sometimes to your leader, your coachee, with some data to help them think about what are some of these underlying causes for why they're seeing this resistance. People called out the importance of communication, that's one of the key things here. And we absolutely want to emphasize that with them. Optimize transparency, which we know oftentimes will really add to people's sense of control and trust. They know what's going on. They're not being kept in the dark. We joke about the mushroom approach to leading, which is keep them in the dark and feed them manure. Not a good way to create trust with your employees. You want to help your leaders really promote employee engagement. When things are happening so quickly and our leaders are under a tremendous amount of stress, sometimes they lose track of the fact that they're going to get this work done through their employees, and they need their employees to be highly engaged. So you want to bring them back to making sure they're prioritizing that. Building trust is something obviously that our leaders need to do to be successful. So when you're coaching them, you want to be checking in on how that's going. How is your leader continuing to build trust with their people? Where are the trust deficits that you need them to address? Part of that, being able to get that information, is creating feedback loops. So a core principle of operating effectively within a complex adaptive system is the ability to create feedback loops so that the leader is able to constantly be learning what's happening, how is their impact landing, and what do they need to do to adapt. So this is true for both individuals and teams, and one could say for companies as well. You want to help them develop adaptive change strategies. You want to help them anticipate and prepare for what we call emergent behavior, unexpected things that emerge and then can kick up greater resistance within the organization. You want to help them, your leaders, to measure and evaluate the right KPIs, key performance indicators, in order to track the impact of the change initiatives and the effectiveness of management efforts on that resistance. You want to help them regularly evaluate in progress. So one of the things we always like to say is we want to assess, understand what is, plan what we're going to do, take action, and then reflect. And so part of that reflection is an evaluation of how's it going, and then what can we do to do even better? how can we innovate? And finally, we want to make sure that not only are our leaders providing emotional support to their people, but we as coaches are providing emotional support to those leaders. So that's really critical for us as coaches to be able to do. All right, Steve, I think we've covered a lot, and we will include some additional materials in the deck that we sent, but I want to make sure that we're reserving some time for some Q&A.
So let's do that now, Dan. Let's go ahead and ask for.
Yes. Do we have questions? We have comments for Dan and Steve? Well, place them in the chat, please. I don't see any questions. Yes.
Got it. Okay, so Ricardo, thank you. Let me read what Ricardo wrote. Compliments for the methodology presented. It reminds me conceptually of two books I'm reading, The Age of Agile and Humanocracy. In Brazil, most organizations still have a cultural model where the pressure for results makes the command and control model predominate. I believe there is still a trap where the leader must delegate more and demonstrate transparency and vulnerability versus the fear of not reaching goals. What do you think about this? Steve, you want to take first crack?
I mean, I think it's it sounds like it's true in Brazil, and I know it's true elsewhere as well. I think the danger is that with the world getting so more complex, that leaders feel increasing pressure, and that pressure translates into I need to demonstrate competence and get things done, and sort of we turn inward in that environment. We sort of try and wall ourselves off from the uncertainty, and I think that maybe in the short term can feel good, but I think in the long term we really risk severing the relationships that we need to help get things done and to understand, get increased insight around what's happening in the external environment. So we focus on the small things that we can control versus the much bigger picture. And I think that's a challenge. I mean, I'm sure that's always been a challenge for leaders. I think it's a challenge more so today than it once was. I think our job as coaches is to help leaders, manage that tension, right? Because that's less of a problem to be solved and more of a tension to be managed between the need to, get things done in the here and now, but also, keep our eyes on the bigger picture. And I think that's one of the ways that we as coaches can add value is to re-interject and continue to remind leaders around the importance of taking the bigger picture, the longer view. But I definitely think it's hard. And if it was easy, then I think leaders wouldn't need our help the way that they do.
Great. Thanks, Steve. And what I would add, Ricardo, to what Steve shared, there's not there's not much to add. He kind of nailed it. But oftentimes with the leaders that I work with, when they're under the kind of stress that's not uncommon, is they are gripping the wheel really tight. And we know from jet fighters who are flying these super fast jets, the tighter that they grip the wheel on that or their controls, the worse off they are, that they have to really relax and let go. And that's where I think some of the vulnerability comes in and risk taking when you are working with with the leaders, working with their employees and trusting them and delegating to them, because there's no way if they're doing everybody's job, they're in, they're in trouble. And one of the stories I love to share is I worked with a very effective senior executive, and he had a direct report who was absolutely brilliant. You give him something to do and he's going to do it just perfect, and you could rely on him. And he struggled greatly, though, as you can imagine, as a manager and leader, because he had such high standards for things that he didn't trust anyone to actually get it done. So he rarely delegated it. He would do it himself. And he then complained to my client, my coachee, hey, I don't have any more bandwidth. I can't do anything. I'm flat out. And so instead, my coachee gave him more people to manage, more work to get done, because it forced him then to be able to delegate in that situation, and he had to get vulnerable. So that was a great example of a leader really getting somebody to be able to adopt the right the right practices. Flavio, I know we're up at the top of the hour, and you had your hand up.
Yes, yeah. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Steve. You're probably reading lots of compliments to your presentation in the chat. That was really awesome. Very good, very insightful. Thank you very much. What I wanted to let people know that they should click on the link to the evaluation or the assessment of this event, which will allow everyone to get their continuing education credits from ICF. I wouldn't like to let people go before they do it. And so if you're interested in your continuing education credits, please just click at the link that was sent to you in the chat box. Anna, can you send that again, please, so that
Agora eu coloquei ali o link do conteúdo e vou repetir o link da avaliação, tá?
okay. There you have, we have coming events, ICW events in today up to, in fact, until Sunday. So if you want to join those events, please go to the ICW 2024 page at the ICF site and register for those. We just have Anna just posted the certification, the credit for attendance and the evaluation of this event. Dan and Steve, thank you so much for this very insightful presentation. Thank you for making yourselves available to us, to ICF and to this ICW event. So we'll stay here for a few more minutes so that people can post their last comments.
Thanks again for having us.
Thank you
Great
all.
participation. Loved people's thoughts and comments. And next time in Rio or Sao Paulo or wherever you direct us to, we'd love to be there in person.
Oh, that would be great. And maybe your sister might be your tour guide in Brazil.
She would like that very much.
Yeah, I would also like to mention that ICF Brazil is supporting people that have been affected by the tremendous flood in the Rio Grande do Sul. Please, please, please help them by donating everything you can. This is the worst disaster that has ever happened in Brazil. We have probably 100,000 people homeless, no hospitals, no schools, no nothing. So please donate to them. It can be money, clothes, medicine, whatever, cleaning stuff, mattresses, everything. So ICF is committed to helping those in need. So thank you very much, and I think this is time to say goodbye.
Thanks
Bye,
again.
Flavio. Goodbye, everyone. Thank
Thank
you.
you, everybody.
Cheers.
Bye-bye, everyone.